In the darkest hours of World War II, while the world was engulfed in the flames of battle, a group of women defied every norm, every expectation, and took to the skies. Their planes, slow, fragile biplanes, sounded like nothing more than a whisper in the night. But what they carried with them was nothing short of a nightmare for the Nazi forces. They were called the Night Witches, and their presence in the air struck terror into the hearts of the German army. They would fly under cover of darkness, their engines often cut off as they silently approached their targets, defenseless soldiers, fuel dumps, strategic supply lines, and then, without warning, they would unleash hell. These women were not just pilots, they were warriors. This is their untold story. The year was 1941, and the Soviet Union was in the grip of one of the most brutal conflicts in history. The Eastern Front of World War II was ravaged by the German invasion, pushing deeper into Soviet territory with each passing day. Faced with mounting losses and the desperate need for every possible combat unit, the Soviet government turned to a new, unexpected source: women. Amidst the chaos and destruction, a group of women would emerge, becoming one of the most effective and feared combat units in the Soviet Air Force. These women were not your typical pilots. They had no experience in aerial warfare, no training in flying complex military aircraft, and yet they were about to become one of the most haunting legends of World War II. Their regiment, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, made up entirely of women, was formed in response to the urgency of the situation. It was here, in the depths of the Soviet war effort, that the Night Witches would take flight, literally and figuratively. They were given some of the oldest, most obsolete biplanes, the Po-2s, hardly capable of outpacing a light breeze, yet they would strike terror into the heart of the German military with their audacity, precision, and stealth. In the face of overwhelming danger, they would become the harbingers of death in the night skies. But what makes this tale even more remarkable isn't just their courage or their determination. It's the raw, unfiltered reality they faced every single night. They flew into the teeth of danger, stealthy and silent like ghosts. For the German soldiers below, it wasn't just the bombs they feared, it was the chilling, near-silent approach of these witches, coming out of nowhere, leaving destruction in their wake. Many of these women didn't survive. Some of their comrades fell under enemy fire, while others vanished into the abyss of war. Yet, even in death, their legacy would not be fully realized, their contributions ignored by history for decades. The Night Witches were nearly erased from the history books, their names forgotten by all but a few, their bravery almost lost to time. But now, we bring their incredible story to light. In 1941, as the brutal conflict of World War II raged on, the Soviet Union found itself in desperate need of pilots. The male soldiers had been sent to the front lines in overwhelming numbers, leaving the country's military leadership facing a harsh reality. The gap in the Air Force was vast, and every potential resource needed to be tapped. What followed was a decision that seemed almost impossible for the time, one that would challenge deep-seated norms and change the course of warfare. The Soviet Union turned to its women. In a nation where women had long been relegated to roles of homemakers, caregivers, and workers in factories, the prospect of women taking to the skies as combat pilots was almost unthinkable. But in a time of crisis, the rules were altered. The Soviet regime, never one to shy away from breaking tradition, began recruiting women into roles once considered off-limits. Women were enlisted for every conceivable military job: nurses, tank drivers, snipers, but it was in the air that they would leave an indelible mark. At first, the reaction from both male officers and soldiers was one of skepticism. Would these women, most of whom had never flown before, be able to handle the brutal reality of combat? Would they be able to endure the hardships of war in an era when women were still expected to stay at home? These questions echoed across the Soviet military hierarchy, and the doubts were rampant. But the Soviet leadership knew that desperate times required extraordinary measures, and in that desperation, they began training women to take on one of the most dangerous tasks in war: piloting bombers at night. As the Soviet military scrambled to fill its ranks, one woman stood out: Marina Raskova, a legendary aviator known as the Russian Amelia Earhart, understood the value of breaking through barriers. Roscova, having already made her mark as an accomplished pilot, lobbied tirelessly for the creation of an all-female flying regiment. Her belief in the women of her country was unwavering. She didn't just see them as placeholders or secondary recruits. She saw them as capable warriors who could and would defend their homeland with the same ferocity and skill as any man. Despite the resistance, Roscova's persistence led to a remarkable breakthrough. She was able to convince the Soviet military that women could fly, bomb, and fight just as effectively as their male counterparts. As a result, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment was born. This was no ordinary unit. Composed entirely of women, the regiment was tasked with a mission that would define them, flying bombing raids under the cover of darkness, silently making their way into enemy territory, and striking before the Germans could even react. The pilots that formed the 588th came from all walks of life. Some were young students, some were factory workers, and some were peasants, all with little to no experience in combat aviation. Yet what they lacked in training, they made up for in heart and determination. The regiment became a haven for those who wanted to fight for their country, to prove that women were as capable of bravery and heroism as any man on the battlefield. The first flights of the 588th were far from routine. With little more than basic training and the will to succeed, the women were sent out in some of the most outdated aircraft in the Soviet fleet, Po-2 biplanes, which had been used for crop dusting before the war. These planes were slow, fragile, and barely capable of flying over the front lines. Yet, in the dark of night, the night witches would make their mark. They weren't just flying, they were setting the stage for a relentless campaign of terror. Night after night, the women of the 588th flew their missions. Theirs was a form of combat unlike any other. Their bombers would cut their engines mid-flight, gliding silently through the night, only to release their payloads over the enemy's positions without a sound. The German soldiers below, often unaware of their approach, would hear nothing but the night air before the bombs dropped. These night attacks were terrifying, not only because of the damage done, but because they were so unpredictable, so disorienting. The Germans would wake in the dead of night, caught off guard, always wondering if they were about to be bombed again. Despite the dangers, these women persisted. The night became their ally, and their resolve hardened with each passing mission. The soldiers of the 588th knew they weren't just fighting an external enemy. They were fighting to prove their worth in a world that had told them they were inferior, that their place wasn't in the sky, much less in the heart of a war. Yet, here they were, carving out a new place in history. The day they arrived at the training base, the women of the 588th faced not just the physical demands of flight training, but the harsh judgment of those who believed they would never succeed. From the moment they set foot on the tarmac, the air was thick with skepticism. The men in charge, the ones who had long flown the skies, could hardly conceal their doubts. Women? Pilots? In this war? They'd mutter under their breath. But the women knew one thing that would carry them through. They were about to prove the world wrong. The training was brutal, physically demanding, and mentally exhausting. They weren't just learning to fly, they were learning to defy history itself. The Po-2 biplanes they flew were relics of a time long gone, slow, fragile, and far from ideal for combat. These planes were meant for crop dusting, not for the deadly dance of aerial warfare. The women had to master low-altitude flight, a technique that required precision and nerves of steel, especially when flying under the radar and avoiding detection from enemy forces. This was no simple task. Day after day, they faced long hours of training, often in the bitter cold. Flying in a plane that barely made it above the treetops, they learned to maneuver through the sharpest turns and most treacherous skies. Their targets were stationary objects, but the real challenge was in making sure they would never be seen. They were required to release bombs with pinpoint accuracy, all while gliding silently through the night, hoping that the enemy would never even know they had been there. And yet, the women trained with a fierce determination that matched the strength of their adversaries. When they failed, they pushed themselves harder. When the engines sputtered or the planes didn't respond as they should, they kept at it. Giving up was never an option. Training wasn't just physically demanding, it was a test of endurance that took place under some of the harshest conditions imaginable. The winter months in the Soviet Union were unforgiving. Temperatures would plummet well below freezing, and the winds howled through the training fields. In these brutal conditions, the women were pushed to their limits, not only as aviators, but as human beings. Every mission, every flight was a challenge to their very survival. The cold wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a constant adversary. The metal of the Po-2 biplanes would freeze in the icy wind, making every takeoff feel like a gamble. The women had to learn to handle equipment that didn't always work properly in such freezing temperatures. But even as their fingers went numb and their faces turned red with frostbite, they pressed on. There was no choice but to endure. Every flight was a risk, not just from the enemy, but from the elements themselves. The frozen air inside their cockpits could feel suffocating, their hands shaking from both the cold and the overwhelming pressure to perform. In these conditions, the bonds between the women grew. They were more than just comrades in arms, they were sisters in struggle. When one woman faltered, the others picked her up. They helped each other, not only through the physical hardships of training, but through the psychological toll it took to constantly prove themselves in the face of doubt and disdain. They shared everything: food, warmth, stories of home, and it was this solidarity that gave them strength. Together, they faced what seemed impossible and pushed through because they knew their success meant more than just personal achievement. It was the success of every woman who had ever been told she couldn't do something simply because of her gender. They weren't just preparing to fly, they were preparing to fight for something much greater than themselves. This was about proving that they belonged, not just as pilots, but as warriors, capable of facing anything war could throw at them, whether it was freezing temperatures, hostile skies, or the pressure to fail. As they trained under these harsh conditions, something remarkable began to happen. They formed a bond that was deeper than mere comradeship. In every struggle, in every moment of exhaustion, they found in each other not just strength, but a shared understanding. The women of the 588th began to see each other not just as fellow pilots, but as family. They had all been cast into the fire of skepticism, isolation, and hardship, but together they were unbreakable. Even when they returned to the barracks after long days of flying, their thoughts were on each other. They knew that if one of them failed, it wasn't just an individual loss, it was a blow to their entire regiment. They carried the weight of each other's survival. They carried the knowledge that the success of the regiment would depend on each individual's commitment, not just to the mission, but to each other. In a world that had told them they didn't belong, they fought to prove that they not only belonged, but were an essential part of the war effort. They weren't just preparing for battle, they were preparing to make history. Imagine the feeling: the weight of the air thick with expectation, the tremor of the engines starting, and the silence that followed once they shut off. On their first night out, the women of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment had no illusions about what they were facing. These were no ordinary missions. These were high-stakes operations, launching from the Soviet base and flying into the unknown under the cover of darkness. Their biplanes, the Po-2s, were fragile, slow, and almost obsolete. Their wings could barely cut through the wind, and their engines strained with every turn. Yet, these women knew one thing: speed wasn't their weapon. Stealth was. In the cover of night, with the roar of their engines silenced, they became invisible ghosts in the sky. The German forces never saw them coming. They struck silently, in darkness, targeting key positions like supply lines, airfields, and enemy troop movements. Every mission was an act of faith. Every takeoff was a risk. They knew the enemy would be ready to defend themselves, but they also knew the Germans weren't prepared for what was about to happen. The Night Witches were coming. With every silent takeoff, the women knew they were becoming a shadow that haunted the German forces, disrupting their plans night after night. Fear was something that clung to the German soldiers as the sound of the engines cutting out would echo through the air. followed by the deafening explosion of a bomb. The first few missions were terrifying, yes, but the women soon became masters of this dark art, and their reputation began to spread. They weren't just flying planes, they were outwitting the enemy. These women, many of them with little combat experience, quickly adapted to the unique challenges of aerial combat in a way no one had anticipated. The Po-2s, their only available aircraft, may have been outdated, but the pilots turned every weakness into a strength. They weren't meant to compete in speed or firepower. They learned to rely on something more elusive: surprise. Flying just above the treetops, the pilots of the 588th would cut the engine of their planes, gliding through the night like phantoms. In absolute silence, they would approach enemy lines, using only the stars as their guide, their senses finely tuned to every dip and curve of the land below. The enemy, unaware of their approach, would have no warning until the bombs were already falling from the sky. At the last moment, the women would pull the plane into a steep dive. It was a technique born of desperation and brilliance. The noise of the bomb dropping, an almost otherworldly sound, sharp and terrifying, would reverberate through the enemy camp just as the aircraft vanished back into the darkness. And then, silence. The psychological impact was devastating. The German soldiers had no idea where the next attack would come from. They lived in constant dread, never knowing when or where the next bomb would fall. For the German forces, the impact was far more than physical. This was psychological warfare on a level the Nazis had not prepared for. The pilots, those women of the 588th, became their worst nightmare. German soldiers soon came to know them only by their eerie nickname, Nachthexen, the Night Witches. It was a name born not out of admiration, but of fear. The German soldiers could hear the soft whine of the engines as the aircraft glided in, only to have that sound suddenly stop, replaced by the terrifying silence before a bomb dropped, followed by a gut-wrenching explosion. Night after night, these women struck. Their missions were relentless. To the German forces, it seemed as though the very night itself had turned against them. The unpredictability of the attacks, the vulnerability of not knowing when the next assault would come, gnawed at the soldiers' nerves. The relentless fear of the unknown, of a single plane appearing from the shadows and tearing through their defenses, was enough to break the morale of even the toughest soldiers. They began to fear the very nightfall itself. Nothing could prepare the Germans for this kind of warfare. These women, flying in nearly impossible conditions, became the symbol of terror in the dark. The Night Witches had taken on the skies of Nazi-occupied Europe, and the enemy never fully recovered from the psychological scars they left behind. As the missions continued, the stakes only grew higher. The Germans may have feared the night, but the women of the 588th were not done yet. They would push beyond their limits, fighting not just against an enemy, but against the very elements that threatened to bring them down. As the months passed, the nature of war shifted. The skies grew darker, not only because of the night, but because of the ever-looming threat that came from below. The night was no longer just a shield. It became a battlefield in itself. For the women of the 588th, the tension became unbearable. Anti-aircraft fire, once a distant threat, became an ever-present danger. These women, flying in fragile biplanes, knew every mission could be their last. The odds stacked higher with every flight. But they didn't hesitate. They couldn't. Somewhere over the German front lines, in the midst of a bombing raid, one of the planes would be hit. The engines would splutter and die. Pieces of the fragile Po-2 would break apart, yet the women would still push forward. Some made it back to base, but many didn't. These were the pilots who had become the backbone of the regiment, women whose courage and resilience were unmatched. And yet, one by one, they began to fall. The loss was constant, unbearable. For every mission, there was the knowledge that someone might not return. Every pilot who didn't come back was not just a name lost. It was a sister. The strength of the regiment was built not only on the women's courage, but on the unshakable bond of sisterhood they formed through shared loss, fear, and triumph. There were pilots who made history not only because of their skill, but because of their willingness to face the unthinkable. Women like Yevdokia Zavali, known across the regiment for her daring maneuvers and unbreakable spirit. During one particularly harrowing mission, her plane was hit, smoke pouring from the engine, flames licking at the wings. But Zavali wasn't one to retreat. She turned the crippled aircraft back towards the enemy, diving down into the fray again, raining bombs onto the German positions even as her plane threatened to fall apart. It was the mark of a true hero, someone who understood the meaning of sacrifice. But it wasn't just one act of bravery. This was the reality for the Night Witches. Every flight was a dance with death. And yet, despite the odds, they returned to the skies, even after their planes had been shot to pieces. They would go back again, sometimes flying with barely functional planes, risking their lives to ensure that their mission was completed. No matter how many times the odds stacked against them, they kept flying, not for the glory, but for each other. They knew that failure wasn't an option. It could mean the end of the regiment, the end of their sisterhood. And beyond the battlefield, it wasn't just the physical dangers they faced. There were countless instances where the pilots would save their comrades, flying dangerously low to help those stranded in enemy territory. These were women who, even with the sky collapsing around them, never hesitated to put their lives at risk for someone else. Their actions weren't just acts of bravery, they were acts of love and loyalty, which kept the regiment together. As the war waged on, the pilots of the 588th proved themselves to be unparalleled warriors. Yet the biggest battles were not always fought in the sky. Once the war ended, a new battle began for these women, one for recognition, respect, and equality. Despite their undeniable achievements, they were often overlooked, even by their own government. The Soviet Union, a nation that had called upon them to fight, was quick to forget their contributions when the fighting stopped. The men who had fought alongside them, the men who had been saved by their courage, were lauded, but the Night Witches were often pushed aside, their heroism disregarded. It wasn't just the government that failed them. The women who had fought so fiercely against the Nazis still faced resistance from the male soldiers they served alongside. The same men who had been protected by these pilots' skill and bravery now turned their backs, refusing to acknowledge the vital role the women played in the victory. They had earned respect in the skies, but back on the ground, respect was hard to come by. They were still regarded as nothing more than women in an all-male world of war. But the women of the 588th did not let this defeat them. They carried the weight of their sacrifice in silence, knowing that their true legacy was not for others to define, but for them to remember. They had taken to the skies when others said they couldn't. They had carried out missions that others said were impossible. And they had done it with a courage that the world would eventually recognize. But it would take time. As the final days of World War II unfolded, the Night Witches' relentless nighttime raids had significantly weakened German forces, notably during pivotal confrontations like the Battle of Stalingrad. Their unwavering commitment and effectiveness in the field earned them the admiration of their comrades and instilled fear among their adversaries. Despite these remarkable contributions, the Soviet government scarcely acknowledged their valor. The regiment was disbanded merely 6 months after the war concluded, and during the Grand Victory Parade in Moscow, they were conspicuously absent. The official rationale cited the perceived obsolescence of their slow-moving aircraft, overshadowing the undeniable impact of their missions. Transitioning from the front lines to civilian existence presented formidable challenges for these pioneering women. Many returned to a society that expected them to conform to traditional roles as wives and mothers, overlooking their extraordinary wartime achievements. While some continued their aviation pursuits, ascending to notable positions within the industry, others faced societal indifference and personal struggles. The lack of official recognition left emotional scars, as their sacrifices and accomplishments were relegated to the shadows of history. Decades after the war, a collective reckoning acknowledged the profound contributions of the Night Witches. Memorials were erected, literature was penned, and cinematic adaptations brought their saga to global audiences. This resurgence of interest not only celebrated their bravery, but also highlighted the broader struggle for women's recognition in military history. The Night Witch's legacy serves as a testament to resilience, challenging societal norms, and the enduring spirit of sisterhood amidst the horrors of war. As our exploration of the Night Witch's remarkable journey concludes, we turn to you, our viewers. What aspects of these women's courage and resilience have left a lasting impression on you? In what ways do you believe their contributions have reshaped our understanding of women's roles in warfare? Share your thoughts and reflections in the comments section below. But this is just the beginning. In upcoming episodes, we will delve into other untold narratives of women who defied societal expectations to serve on the front lines. From ancient warrior queens to modern-day combatants, these stories illuminate the strength, resilience, and indomitable spirit of women throughout history. Stay tuned as we continue to uncover these inspiring tales.